Event and Text in the Early First Isaiah, Part 5. Theologizing the Monarchy, Isaiah 7 through 13, chapter 7, 13 through 16, 9 to 5 and 6, and chapter 11. We might well have dubbed this the Christmas Special, as it deals with three texts from the beginning of the Isaiah scroll that were used in early Christian writings as proof texts for the argument that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah and that he had participated in the divinity in a unique way. The common carol, O Come Emmanuel, and Handel's Messiah have made these texts part of the common culture of this season. At best, however, this timing is only a matter of serendipity, and it presents us with a difficulty since our goal is to understand these texts in the context of their 8th century origin, not in the sense of subsequent appropriations, the justification of which belongs to another forum. As the prophetic school of Jerusalem neared the end of their first attempt at the text, they pondered the problem of how it should end. What they had in hand was a text that was substantially what we know as chapter 3 through 9. It was an admonition to Judah and Jerusalem to prepare for their future, which would be driven by the rise of the Assyrian Empire. It was, of course, some satisfaction for them that the prophecy that they had delivered to Ahaz had come true. Neither the king of Damascus, Rezin, or the king of Jerusalem, Pekah, were in power. They had witnessed the Assyrian campaigns of 734 and 733, which made their warnings of suffering to come all too palpable. This said, it remained that the warning about what was about to come needed to be balanced with the hope that they held for the future. Already in the text at hand, they had made an effort to cast their hope for Israel's future in the figure of a person, a royal, who would be the epitome of a transformed Israel. This is first explored in chapter 7, 13 through 16, and then expanded, chapter 9, 5 through 6. Building on this lead, they would take this expression of hope to a new level in another poem, which would become the core of chapter 11, their penultimate chapter of the evolving text. In this talk, I will review two early versions of the birth sign, and then turn to the form it took in chapter 11, a complement to all that had gone before. The prophetic message delivered by King Ahaz by Isaiah was meant as an assurance. Do not be afraid, stay calm, as the threat of Assyria and the northern kingdom to replace him, indeed the Davidic dynasty, would fail, and their own kings would be replaced. The prophet is seconded by a sign from God. In spite of Ahaz's dismissal of a need for sign, read by Isaiah as a kind of a false deference, the sign was given. A young woman, Ha'amah, was conceived, Hira, and will give birth to a son, Yaladetot Ben, and his name will be called Emmanuel. The fact that Christians read this text as virgin and as referring to the conception of the birth of Jesus has made a simple reading of the text really quite difficult. Note that if it was a sign for Ahaz, it had to be about something that would happen in the near future. In fact, the sign is to clarify the duration of how long it would take before the two threatening kings, Rezin and Pekah, would lose power. It would be less than a year, or less than the time it would take for a child to be born and to develop the primitive ability to distinguish between sweet and sour. Grimace, honey and milk, smile. The definitive article on the word mean, young woman, indicates that the audience, Ahaz, would know who the woman was that was to be the mother. Ahaz is a young king who recently had ascended to power, and the birth of his heir was very much what he needed to secure his kingship. That makes it the most likely prospect for the child to be Hezekiah, Ahaz's actual heir. The alternative proposal that is sometimes floated about is that it is the third son for the prophet, but that's simply excluded by the reference in chapter 8, where Isaiah himself in his own voice makes clear he has two sons, Shahar and Mahar. Isaiah also in the same chapter refers to the land of Jerusalem and Judah as belonging to Emmanuel, which makes sense if one identifies the child as the royal heir, namely Hezekiah. The identity of the child is one part of our task, and the other is to understand what it means for his name to be Emmanuel. Its meaning, God with us, is easy enough to understand, but what does it mean for a royal person to possess the name? That's more difficult for us to understand. With Isaiah 7:14, a stream of history has begun, which will begin progressively to become more evident as we observe the prophetic school theologizing the monarchy. If we have read this right, we can say that with the sign, the school has made the claim that whatever else the monarchy gives to Israel, it will provide it with the presence of God. That might seem like making too much of an isolated text, but it is quickly joined by a second text, which announces the birth of the Son, 9:5-6, in a dramatic poem, which is actually the anchor of chapter 9. We have a perfect expression of the sense that this is Hezekiah. Clearly, the composition is dated after the Assyrian campaign of 734, but before the campaign of 733. Following so quickly in content with, as well as in time with the manual text, there is every reason for us to think that the birth announcement is the very child whose conception had been foretold in chapter 7. Any doubt to this arises because of Christian appropriation of the text as foretelling the birth of Jesus. This means the Jewish commentaries are driven to find arguments that deny its messianic interpretations, and Christian commentaries, even liberally oriented ones, to hedge. The result is that it appears to make the text more mysterious than it actually is, and would lead to an unmerited disassociation of the conception prophecy in 7 with the birth announcement in chapter 9. As we now turn to look at the content of chapter 9, 5-7, the first thing to underline is that the unit is a polished poem. For a child has been born for us, a son has been given to us, the authority of rule which will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wondrous Counselor, God of Might, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. for them, that is for Israel. It will be for an enlargement of rule and for peace without end on the throne of David and his kingdoms, for the establishment of it and for the support of unity and justice now and forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. The craft and ingenuity of this unit is particularly evident when one looks at the Hebrew. Translations move from words on a page to ready-made words in our own world. Words that come to be on this Isaiah page needed to be fashioned by the poet to say something that his world had not heard. Let us begin with what the poet indicates as the child's role. The role that is laid on his shoulders is translated in English as authority, in Greek as arche, as a legal right, or as primacy. But the Hebrew word is not well represented by those translations. The Hebrew word is an activity, which might best be called governance. To make this word, the poet takes the word for prince or commander, sar, and turns it into a participle by means of a performative men, and then makes it into an activity that the prince does at a certain time and place by adding a hey that makes it a definite noun, which might best be translated the governance. The name that follows are likewise dramatic innovations, pushing the envelope. The second name is translated mighty God, but it's not so simple in the Hebrew. The poet put on the page El Gabor. El, the common word for God. Gabor, the common word for a warrior or a man of valor. If the poet had written Gabor El, it would be a simple Hebrew construct indicating possession, God's warrior. But of course he didn't, and in doing so signaled a higher poetic, one which we'll be able to further explore when we come to chapter 11, which among other things will show that this theologizing of the dynastic figure is not an isolated occurrence in an early Isaiah scroll, but is a vector that will advance from here into the latest layers of the scroll, including the suffering servant themes, and beyond in the messianism of Judaism, later Judaism, and of early Christianity. We're now ready to look at chapter 11. Our first question is, how does this chapter fit the text 3 through 9, which has been growing in the aftermath of the prophetic event of the spring? It is often alleged that on the grounds that its content to be an editorial intrusion from a much later time. But the beginning of the verse of the chapter is introduced by a conjunction of awe, which signals that the person responsible for locating it here wanted the reader to understand that it was connected to the last verse of chapter 10. In 10, the prophetic school was reflecting theologically on the Assyrian campaign of 734 and 733. That reflection centered on the proposition that the Assyrian king was acting as God's agent, and ended with the metaphor of deforestation to convey the effects of those campaigns. The Assyrians, that is God through them, was lopping off branches and falling trees. The deforestation metaphor is consistent with the theme of rewilding, which is already a pattern that we have seen in the early Isaiah text. Moreover, it is particularly relevant to the campaign's impact on Lebanon and that arc across northern Israel known as the Galilee. In the pattern already established, devastation is followed with a sign of hope. If we're alert to that pattern, we will anticipate an expression of hope, and we would not miss the importance of the Va in 11:1 and and a shoot, Qatar, shall spring from the stump, Gaza of Jesse, from his root, fruit, Ma Sharav, Yafar Yah. The image is connected with a similar image of renewal of the dynasty in the later layers of the biblical text, which prompts some to argue that this had been read back into the text at a much later time. But the language here is unique and strongly suggests that it belongs to the beginning of the literary tradition, not to its end. Moreover, it has a precedence in chapter 6, where in verse 13, hope is expressed in the capacity of a Davidic dynasty to renew itself. Like an oak, when it is cast down to a stump, the seed is in it. Ga'elion asher bashalaktak batzakbat bam sarah kadesh matzakbata. Note the idea is common, but the language varies. Branch, seed, again suggesting that we are at the beginning of a tradition which hasn't emerged as a formula at this point in time. There's, of course, a messianic coloration, but here it should be taken as referring, as in 7 and 9, to the near future of the dynasty. Indeed, to Ahaz's successor, none other than Hezekiah. The gifts of this successor, if taken to be mythic or hyperbolic, feeds the impression that we're talking about material that belongs to a post-exilic age of Judaism. It is true that the mythologizing of the Assyrian king has given rise to these claims. Over against these claims, the prophetic school created a language, neither mythic nor hyperbolic, in which a very human king plays a theological role. Already in chapter 9, the king is wondrous counsel, God of might, an everlasting Father. And here we have a new round of language in chapter 11, which indicates the source of this activity, which makes these nouns possible. The theological term is ruach, movement, which will rest, nakah, upon the young king. This agency will be experienced by him as a wisdom and understanding, as counsel and heroism, as knowledge and fear of the Lord. All these activities unfold in a poetic unit that has all the sophistication that we have come to expect from the 8th century Isaiah. The poem concludes in a verse 6 with a metaphor of dress of an earthly king. His waist has been girded with righteousness and his thighs with faithfulness. The theological argument that produced this poetic unit continued its thought in verse 10, where it indicates that the royal figure would have an impact on the larger world. In the typical formula of a prophetic pronouncement, the text declares that it shall come to pass on that day. The root of Jesse will stand as an ensign, a noose. Unto him the nation shall come and seek knowledge. The term root of Jesse to identify the bearer of the ensign ties it to verse 1 of chapter 11 and to the Davidic image of a warrior king in battle dress, girded with righteousness and faithfulness, verse 5. The use of the word ensign, the signal of a warrior king, has already occurred in chapter 5, where it summoned the Assyrians to come and play their role as the rod of God's wrath. Here, it stands as a form of closure, reversing the action, calling all those who have been lost and scattered by the assault to return. With this, the prophetic school offers an image of a transformed world. A highway is to be made from Egypt to Assyria, a splendid metaphor to identify a peaceful world that even now causes us to pause with imagination. Imagine the open highway, no checkpoints, from Rafah crossing to Damascus. In this prophetic view of the end of the Assyrian aggression, one might wonder if we have made some kind of jump in history. Since when we began to look at chapter 11, it seemed that we were still at a stage where the aggression remained largely anticipated. Could this then date chapter 11 to be considerably later date? I think not. For embedded in this final prophecy is the hope that the envy of Ephraim shall be ended, and the oppression of Judah shall be cut off. Clearly, we are at a period of time when that still has meaning. After the destruction of Damascus in 722, or shortly thereafter, it's a irrelevant hope, as Ephraim has ceased to exist. In spite of the attempt of both Jews and Christians to read this text as messianic, their actual references is to the situation which confronts Judah and Jerusalem in the late 8th century. The prophetic school of Jerusalem held a profound, even transcendental hope that Ahaz's successor, Hezekiah, would be a truly transforming figure. Within that school, a poet created this exceptional vision, dream, or could we better name it hope, for his fellows to use in their theological reflection. In future studies, we will see how it fared when Hezekiah took office in 715. It was, however, such a big idea that it was not exhausted at that point and would continue through the latter portions of the Isaiah scroll, most notably in the creation of the Suffering Servant song. And with that, it would continue to live in the messianic appropriations of Jews and Christians. Combined with chapter 10, this served the school with a means of bringing a textual study of Israel's situation in the late 8th century to a closure that was both realistic and hopeful. They signed off on this textual adventure with a perfect poem. It is surely it is God who saves us. Confident that it would stand in the way of anyone who wanted to rewrite or add to it. That poem would serve, they believed, as a baseline for their future attempt to deal with the unfolding events. As we sign off on chapter 11 and its role in the text, we are aware that we have left verses 6 through 9 unaccounted for. Those verses known as the peaceful kingdom. This exquisite poem is worthy of our notice, and we'll take it up in the next talk, along with this splendid poem, Surely It Is God. And then we'll look back at the course we have taken through chapter 3 through 12 and evaluate this hypothesis that indeed a textual unit largely composed in and around 730 BCE served as the basis of the Isaiah scroll.